Okay, so not much has changed, Tom, since the last time you were here, except now we're not talking about the Bible.
We're not talking about well.
Now we moved on. For a few weeks or months, and then we're moving back. We left Genesis chapter 20 or so, left off in May, Genesis chapter 20, to talk about the culture wars and the church in the midst of the culture wars, and how on earth we got the world that we have now from where we came from in the past. So that's what that timeline represents. And we handed it out. We can make some more copies if you're like me and forget about it or left it at home or something, but it's not there. Just a minute. You want to see the timeline. Or maybe you don't want to see the timeline, but this is the timeline. This is what we're talking our way through in the summer. I have no notes, so I'm making this up as I go along, sort of. And some of you in here know a lot about this stuff, and if Doug were here, I know for a fact he would, because we talked about it before. But this is what we're doing. How we got to this unbelievable moral framework and I don't know, cultural situation that we're in today, especially since COVID. As I said last week, I refer to the time before COVID as BC. It's almost like a new year zero for Western civilization and really the whole world. The extraordinary transformation, and it's ongoing. And I'll repeat myself for the 14th time, but I said at the time in the summer of 2020, with everything that was going on with the chaos and the lockdowns and everything, knowing that all of that was going to have huge ramifications for the future of Western civilization, I said that we were at the end of one thing and the beginning of another, but I don't know what we're at the end of, nor what we're at the beginning of. And I think 5 years on, it's beginning to, the right word, crystallize, become clearer, less translucent, where we're headed. Not that I'm willing to make any predictions. Nobody knows. As I also said last week, how many people who made any predictions about the future in January of 2019, 2020, made any predictions about 2021, how many of them were right about anything in January of 2020 or February or the first half of March? None. Zero. Should have been a lesson. Stop trying to predict the future. Stop trying to tell me what's going to happen. You don't know. I don't care how many letters you have to after your name. You have 14 PhDs. Doesn't make any difference. You don't know any more about what's going to happen in the future than I do or anybody else. So stop it. That's my view on that kind of thing. We do know something about the past. And our goal this summer is to understand it. And as we move along through this timeline, you can tell there's a lot of stuff that, as you know, modern 21st century Baptists in the Midwest, a lot of stuff back there that we don't agree with, as in terms of belief systems. And my choice, I like to, and I often do, and it's often disturbing to people, to talk about these events almost in a neutral fashion, so I can understand them. This is what happened. This is what people believe. This is what was going on. And you know, awful lot of it is so different and alien to our belief systems that you want to say, yeah, that's ridiculous, or that's ridiculous, or that's, and you know, okay. But my point is to simply understand it in order to understand, so that we can get to the present and say, okay, I understand now why we have the fights that we have and the moral framework that we have from the past. So that's kind of been my approach. So we talked through that first segment on the left side of that first vertical dotted line, what I am referring to, and I'm not unique to this, the Federation of Bishops that grew out of the establishment of these Christian churches and the leaders of those churches in a very, very decentralized fashion, where you simply have the heads of the churches, Clement of Alexandria, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, and then church fathers like Augustine, Ignatius. I had some names here somewhere. There's the councils, which we're not going to go over again, but there's some names. of the great church fathers. It's not all of them. I chose to stop in about the 400s. Others would continue on and include Leo the Great, who was a mid-5th century church leader in Rome, and instrumental, prelude to where we're going today, instrumental in the Huns not sacking Rome and destroying it. He almost, I don't know if it's an overstatement, somebody who's a better church historian than me, or historian of Western civilization would say, but we'll go that far. It's hard to understate how important Leo was in the survival of Rome when the Huns made their advance, and he literally talked them down, as I understand it, outside the gates, so to speak. So that event then propelled, and others propelled, just by what happened, propelled the stature and the authority of the Roman bishop, unofficially, just, became a de facto very, very first among not even hardly equals anymore. And so that event probably was transformative in bringing an end, in a sense, to this decentralized federation. You just have a bunch of churches. You then, during this period here, have a centralization in process, not even officially. It's just by virtue of the stature of the church in Rome. Because remember, by this point, we're seeing an east-west split, right? The east-west split's not officially going to happen until 1054, right here, often called the Great Schism. When the Eastern, let's look at a map. Here's the church, here's the Roman Empire under Constantine. Let's go back one more. Go to this one. I got two different versions of this map. Interesting. Wow, I didn't even know that. Anyway, this is kind of the Roman Empire. Can I enlarge it? The question is, can I make it normal sized again? Yeah, so that's Constantine was the emperor one removed from Diocletian, who launched probably the harshest persecutions of the church ever, but certainly up to that point. And Constantine fought to reunify. Diocletian had separated in a sense, separated the empire into two pieces, and had appointed, I don't know what you want to call them, regents, whatever you call those things, those people, for the two halves. And when Constantine, who was in the West, Constantine ended that. He became emperor. He won. He became emperor, and he was not having it. And he, in a sense, reunified the empire. I really need a church historian. I mean, a historian of Western civilization. I really need Doug. I think Doug knows a lot about this stuff, but he's not here, so I'm on my own. Anyway, so he takes the throne. He becomes emperor in 324, 325, and he immediately sets in motion a unification project. And fundamental to that is the Christian church. And so this decentralized approach, this decentralized situation that had existed before him is going to end. Because he is going to use the church to unify his empire. And there will come out of that a church-state fusion that is going to result in a unified theology and Bible and official Bible copying, manuscript copying, professionalism about it, all of those things. And that's when we're going to see we saw these great church councils that we talked about that produce things, manifestos, Christian manifestos like the Nicene Creed, which we read a couple of weeks ago. And that Nicene Creed, this is my argument, that Nicene Creed will form the basis for a cultural narrative, a cultural religious narrative for what is now developing as Western civilization. That will be a centralizing force. From king to peasant, you're going to have this religious narrative that it tells a story of origins, of the nature of God, origins, the nature of man, anthropology, so theology and anthropology, human sin, the origination of it, salvation, hope, the return of, eschatology, all of it. You can see it embedded in the Nicene Creed, the greatest, in my view, the greatest statement, theological and narrative statement, based in narrative in the Bible, in the history of the church. But that will then form the basis for the story that these people told themselves about who they are in the world and what God had to do with it. And so when you see in the Nicene Creed, for example, we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, there goes paganism. There goes the paganism of the Roman Empire. Creator of heaven and earth. Well, let's see, this is 300s. We're still 1,500 years away from evolutionary theory. But you can see now that for the next 1,500 years, Western civilization will be nursed, will be sustained by this belief in a creator. And nobody doubted it. And we'll talk about this later, where they have ideas like natural theology, what would become known as science. But to them, it was natural theology, the study of God's creation or something like that. And I forgot why I'm telling all this. But anyway, what's happening now is we have a Western empire, a Western Latin side of the empire and the church based in Rome, right here. And you have an Eastern Greek side, Greek side, based in Constantinople. And this is the place from which Constantinople will be the place from which, you guys can't see me moving my mouth, so no, you can't. It will be the place from which manuscript copying will happen. That will become authoritative in the church. In the West, you will have Jerome's Latin Vulgate, the common Latin. That's what Vulgate means. Vulgar, common, vernacular, whatever word you want to use there. So you'll have a Latin church in the West that's going to have the Latin Bible be authoritative, and you're going to have a Greek church in the East with Koine Greek at the basis for its manuscript copying. But of course, it's the Greek side that's going to get all of the money and the translation tools and the professionalism to do those translations. They're going to translate in Greek and copy manuscripts in Greek, not translate. They're going to copy manuscripts in Greek, and the Latin church is going to copy manuscripts in Latin. And these two this is going to happen in parallel down through the centuries. And we'll get back to that when we get to the Renaissance here shortly. But anyway, ironically, even though the center of political power is in the East, in Constantinople, it's the Roman Church, it's the Latin Church that will hold sway from a religious standpoint. And eventually that sway will become so great that by the time of Pope Innocent III, 1100s, 1200s, right around there, that will be when the Latin Church will have the authority of the Pope, and the Latin Church, we talked about the Pope, we'll get back to it in a minute, in a little bit, will reach its zenith. He had never held as much power, this is my understanding of it, as the papal position had never held as much power as it would under Pope Innocent III, and then not after either. And we'll get back to that. And I'm not going to be able to talk much about it because I quickly exhaust what I know about it. But anyway, it's just fascinating to me that the political power is in the East, but the religious center of gravity is still in the West with that Latin church and that Latin Vulgate. Over here in those Western countries that you see, Spain, France, Great Britannica, what are they calling it now? I don't know what it's called at this point. Italy and so forth. That in that part of the empire, that Latin church, the Latin Vulgate, and so forth will reign supreme. So we'll get back to I'm not sure how much more I can say about that when we get there without sounding like an idiot, but anybody who listens to this on the feed can correct me in the comments if they want. That's the setup. Anybody want to comment on any of that? Tom, what do you think of all that? That was just a spew of words. So, I don't know. That's 4 weeks worth of 4 weeks of stuff introed in a few minutes.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I wanted to say there's one real important thing from Constantinople, from Constantine the East, and that is that they did not believe in infant baptism. That was the biggest split between them and Rome, from what I understand. And I appreciate that as a Protestant that, they held a line on that. I'd have a hard time in their church, though, from what I understand. They do not believe in sitting during church. And with my bad knees, that would be terrible. But I understand they don't have pews. They don't have seats. They stand in their church. And
well, we're gonna get to, the
that's
great-
amazing.
we'll get to the Great Schism in a little bit,
Okay.
where we're gonna
Sorry,
talk
didn't
about.
mean to jump ahead.
No, that's understandable. It's easy to do. I mean, everybody's got what they got on their mind.
Yeah. I
Um,
really do appreciate, though, that they stood on the idea that infant baptism is not what the Bible means. And I love that.
so out of
Because
that,
Rome
that
is
period-
the other way.
out of that period, then you go from this, the Federation of Bishops, with this decentralized situation, to basically in the West, to basically this. And now these two halves are gonna develop on their own, as Kay implied. You're gonna have an Eastern half
Right.
unofficially go its way using a Greek text. And then in the West, you're gonna have a Western church, a Latin church go its way. And that bishop in Rome is going to increase in power, probably catalyzed by what happened with Leo in about 454, 451, something like that, AD. Extraordinary event. Don't assume just because, these people's theology is so different from your, don't assume they're not godly or they're not sincere and so forth. No, these people, they took a lot of chances for what they believed. And Leo and Gregory, who I consider the first pope, is 600 or so. They definitely believed strongly in what they believed and were very pious about it. So we'll get back to that too. But anyway, that's the situation. If I'm not wrong, if I am wrong, somebody can. I have no ego about this. I can't say that about everything, but I have no ego about that in particular, since I'm not a historian. Just enough to make me dangerous. Let's go back to our timeline. Where's my timeline at? You know, want to say something?
It's in your timeline, so.
Oh, you're saying up. Let's get it down here where you're interested. There's the legacy of Constantine. That's probably important. This is the narrative that I was talking about a little while ago, and this narrative will reign for let's see, 1500, 1600 years into the 1800s. It will be overthrown. It will be overthrown with the rise of the critical schools, particularly the scientific ones, with the Enlightenment. Although they didn't overthrow the religious narrative well, yeah, I guess they did. So let's just call it the Enlightenment, and we'll get back to the Enlightenment. But with this is the narrative. This is the story they told about themselves and their origins for the next, I don't know, this is 325, go on to, let's say 1500s, 1600s, the religious wars of the early 1600s or something like, so there it is, 1600, 1300 years or something like that. When the cracks will start, and then, off we go to the period that often is known as modernity. This is referred to now we're getting into the Middle Ages, which will be in a minute, in a little bit, but that'll be the period often referred to self-flatteringly as the pre-modern era. You can hear the bias, right? Modern versus pre-modern. Modern sounds virtuous. Pre-modern sounds exactly like how it sounds, or dark ages, these types of terms. It's all, to me, just very self-flattering, self-congratulatory. But anyway, that's the only event really in here, two events we got to talk about Augustine. Right. And original sin. And his arguments with Pelagius. All right, so let's go back to Augustine. Augustine will be the most important, I don't think it's an overstatement, he is the most important thinker, influence in the history of the church. If you're going to find somebody more so, I don't know who that would be. Except for the couple of people that came before him, one who isn't on this chart, and that's Paul, and then Jesus, who is on the chart. But we talked about this last week. One of the things that Augustine established was the doctrine of original sin for the church. That is inherited sin, because that's debated. That was debated like they debated everything else. And Augustine settled the issue for the church, and that the guilt of Adam's sin is transmitted. It's genetic, and it falls to everyone. And so we have then the idea that you are born in sin, which is not, that doesn't seem questionable to us. We read it in Paul and so on and so forth. But remember, the church is still developing, and they have to decide what they think about these things. Who's going to win the fight? I mean, for all we knew, Marcion could have won the fight over Gnosticism in the 2nd century, or Arius could have won the fight over the deity of Jesus, or the lack thereof, later, but they didn't. The church councils, they fought those fights, and here we are. And the same thing was true with Augustine. So a lot of implications for the idea that sin is transmitted from Adam, and the idea that you're born in sin. And now all of a sudden you have to deal with questions of God's sovereignty and human free will, and the bondage of the will to sin, which is going to be the issue with Martin Luther, who's going to have almost the same fight in the 1500s with a man named Erasmus as Augustine had with a man named Pelagius, which we'll now talk about. So Augustine was a believer because of his understanding of original sin, inherited sin, transmitted sin from birth. He was a believer in what we will call total inability. That since sin is inherited, the human cannot get underneath that and move it out of the way and take a step towards God on his own. That he is entirely at the mercy of God's grace and sovereignty. Total inability, which will become later total depravity in the Calvinist tradition. But for now, total inability. That was his doctrine. And so remember, the church is fighting this fight in the 400s when Augustine is arguing this stuff. He will have an argument with a man named Pelagius, who believed that the guilt of sin is not transmitted, and that human nature is not tainted by Adam's sin, and that therefore humans entirely on their own merit, entirely on their own can produce goods which merit God's favor. That's Pelagian. It's not even that the will is weakened, it's that the will is able. So on the one side, you have totally unable, total inability by Augustine. That's the Augustinian position. And then you have the Pelagian position, which is total ability. Were you going to say something, Phil?
Well, I'm just wondering what Pelagian thought about the writings of Paul. I mean, Romans 7 is pretty clear.
I don't know enough about him to know how these guys are all giants of intellects. I mean, you read their stuff, you understand like every third sentence. And it's also steeped in cultural arguments and so forth that you have to understand. Like if you read a book, J.I. Packer wrote an intro for the book that Martin Luther wrote, which is considered his masterpiece, and which I still think hasn't been refuted, on the bondage of the will, which was a response to Erasmus's on the freedom of the will. But J.I. Packer wrote an intro that's 100 pages. I mean, it's huge. And the reason is you have to understand something about what was going on in the undercurrents of the war over these ideas from the time, to even understand why they're arguing the way that they are. And I don't know enough about that stuff to be able to say anything about Pelagius and Augustine, and why they even started this argument. I don't have the background knowledge on that.
I have a question about evangelism during the Federation of Bishops and now moving into Augustine and the papal and, you know, all these changes going. Did you notice in your studies how evangelism was affected during these times?
I have no idea. I don't know how they, during the period of, officially during the period, once the church becomes centralized, it becomes kind of mandatory. It's like, almost like Judaism. It's a participating in the culture meant participating in the worldview. You know, it's Christendom. It's a church-state fusion. So how, as far as how is how they did not think of it as walking up to somebody on the street and explaining the plan of salvation. That was not their.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
No, they don't. That's not how they. This is a top-down. This is a top-down world.
If I recall correctly, prior to Constantine's was the Edict of Tolerance. The
Mhm.
church was vastly underground church, just like it is in China today.
You stick your head up out of the foxhole and you get a shot off in those days.
So, yeah, so then in terms of obeying what the Bible says about proclaiming the gospel, that was pretty much underground.
But it was probably growing more underground than it was above the ground.
There was a reason to that point. There's a reason that when Constantine, you know, there's a lot of debates about how sincere, you know, Constantine supposedly had a vision where he saw the cross and so on and so forth. There's lots of debates about whether, did he really say all that? And if so, did he just make it up so that he could now be the guy, he would now have a basis for how he's going to unify was it all part of a master plan? My hunch is kind of, yeah. You know, but the point is, it was a top-down approach there, you know, and the church, it was all about the church. The idea of the sort of libertarian, individualistic, go out and share the gospel kind of thing. That's not, I could be wrong about this, but that's not the right way to understand how they thought of things. It was the other way around. And so, you know, once this becomes a narrative and this becomes the culture, will you participate in it? Like, because that's the culture. Some of it's sincere for people and some of it's not. Kind of like it is today. But that's our heritage. That's our past. Everything's going to change with the Protestant Reformation. You can see that world still reflected in some Catholic countries out there, where it's kind of top down, or even in the Orthodox world, in the Greek Orthodox world, in the Russian church and so forth. Much more cultural, much more top down. And I'm not judging either one either way. I'm just simply saying you can kind of see both. You can see both sides of the tradition reflected even today.
In studying history, you see shifts of power between the church and between the kings and emperors.
Then these institutions, these religious institutions become objects of political power and corruption and so on and so forth. And now you get to the Reformation or even the Renaissance with John Wycliffe and so forth. And, you know, the battle's on for political power. Well, even with the Pope, the battle's going to be on. That was one of Luther's big arguments, but we're ahead again. So let's see. That's the fight then between Pelagius and Augustine. Total inability or total ability, if you will. Inherited sin, Augustine, not inherited sin, Pelagius. And you can see then how important, crucial it was, who was going to win that battle in the church. Because if Pelagius wins, how does that change? If total ability wins, where then is God's grace? You can see how much that fight mattered to the future of the church, because Augustine won and Pelagius lost. That's the stakes. So there's a lot to disagree with for me with Augustine. That ain't one of them. That one there, he set the direction. He implanted, if you will, original sin was germinated by Augustine and what came out of that fight. And then what happened, of course, is whenever you have sort of two, let's call them extremes of inability and ability, whenever you have two extremes, what third thing is going to pop up? Huh?
Sort of a synthesis.
Some kind of position in the middle, right? Enter John Cassian, who says, well, you're kind of right and you're kind of right. You know, but you know, you're both kind of wrong too. It's not that nothing is inherited, but it's also not that we have total ability. We still need God's grace because unlike Augustine's wrong because Adam's sin didn't infect the human will, it simply weakened it. So you can see the cooperationist thing. So man has the ability, has some ability. Man has the ability to sort of reach up on his own and ask. And then God will respond. It almost puts God on the responsive side. And we've done this, we do this in the modern world. You know, you have to, God has the ticket. You have to reach out and take it. And you can see that human initiative element. Operationally, you can see an element of human initiative there. This is the big debate. Do I have the ability, says Augustine or Pelagius, does one have the ability to initiate a relationship with God, unprompted, to initiate? That becomes the debate.
For example, when it says, as many as received him, is that initiated by a person or by the Holy Spirit or by God?
The Cassanonians, I don't know what you want to call them, I don't know. Augustine would say, no, that you don't do that without the prior work of God. Pelagius would say, yeah, you entirely on your own merit, if you will, independent of God's grace, you merit his favor. And then there's Cassian. No, it's both. You can reach out, you can initiate, and then he will respond. So then, you know, you receive him. You know, it's this kind of, it's kind of the situation with, you have to, this is why I don't use the ideas like this. You have to ask, how was it said? You have to ask Jesus into your heart, and then he will respond. You can see it kind of getting there. It really depends on how people think about it, but you can see it kind of getting there with where these issues are, you know, people have different ways of naturally thinking about it. Sometimes they'll say it in a way that they don't even really think when they start talking about it. But these are the, you know, we still have it today. We have all of these debates that are still going on to this very day.
Between predestination and.
Well, yeah, I mean, and then there's the God's sovereignty versus human freedom thing, and there's all these other things. But the point here is not to, I'm close to having to judge these things and take a position. You know, it should be obvious,
So
but
I'm thinking basically what you're saying is kind of what religion is to us today. Man trying to find God, and Christianity is God finding man.
Augustine, you are entirely at the mercy of God's grace. You can do nothing. Pelagius, you don't even need him for that. You can merit his favor. You have the ability. You have the ability. And then Cassian.
You don't even need for that, or?
No, you don't need. I don't know his doctrine of salvation. I don't even know if I don't know what he thought of that. I know just enough about him to probably misunderstand him, but I do know he believed in total ability, that God's grace is not required for you to merit his favor. You may need his favor, but well, I don't even know about that. But the point is that you have the good in you. You have the good in you. Augustine, you have no good in you. None, zero, zip,
Non-righteous.
nothing at all. And then there's Cassian. You have the ability to reach out and he will respond. You know, it puts God in this responsive mode, if you will. Even the other way around becomes an issue, right? It's the misinterpretation, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it, of Revelation 3:20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him. And you can see there, depending on how you want to read that, and I think I think the interpretation personally is wrong from the start, but anyway, assuming that you think he's talking about salvation in that sense, in that passage, mankind, if you go that direction, man has the ability to respond. To God knocks, and you have the ability to open the door. There's nothing in that interpretation that says God is prior working on the other side to provoke you, to convict you, to make changes to you, even though most people who use the verse that way think that.
That's not the context of the past.
No, we can talk about Revelation 3:20. We can talk about Revelation 3. It has to do with Greek grammar and some other things, but we can talk about that later. But I'm just making the point that they still float around. These arguments are still going on and swirling. How we talk about the gospel matters. How we talk about salvation. We must individually, this is the 4 laws, I'll pick on them again. We must individually receive Christ as Lord and Savior. Then we can know and experience God's love and plan for our life. You know, boy, that leaves people a lot of room to interpret how they want about what that means. You must individually, because, you know, it's a quotation from John chapter 1, right? But for those who receive him, you know, on 1:12, yeah, and so on and so forth. So, you know, how your basis for your bedrock basis for framework for understanding these things really conditions how you understand those things and how you talk about them. So I tend to be a lot more careful now than I ever was before, so that I'm not misunderstood on these things. But now we're off into theology and everything else, and I just want to. This is Augustine versus Pelagius, and then John Cassian. So now you have total ability, Pelagianism, which is Augustinianism, which is total inability, Pelagianism, which is total ability, Cassianism, which would be semi-Pelagianism. Why does it matter? Because 1,000 years later or more, a little over 1,000 years later, that is precisely what Luther will accuse the Catholic Church of being, semi-Pelagian. He will accuse the church of following John Cassian, even though they claimed they were Augustinian. And he will respond, no, 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 no. I'm the Augustinian. And I'm here to reclaim Augustinianism from Rome, because Rome is semi-Pelagian. That's going to be his argument, which is somewhat strange because many people, I think, correctly interpret John Calvin. I'm sorry, Thomas Aquinas, Catholic scholar, one of the greatest thinkers in the history of the church. He's on my thing here, just after the 1200s there, as practically a Calvinist. So we'll get to that later. But anyway, that's Augustine.
You're leading up to what's coming with the Nicene Creed, going back to this.
Well, I'm just saying that this, as far as the Nicene Creed goes, that religious narrative, the story that they told themselves about God, theology, humanity, human beings, anthropology, who was in control, where we came from, where we're going. That was a religious narrative that was based in Genesis chapter 1 through Jesus. That formed the basis for how they understood their world. So it will not be a coincidence. We'll talk about Michelangelo shortly when we get to the Renaissance. It will not be a coincidence. What does Michelangelo paint on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? One of the greatest works of art.
Creation.
From what to what? From when to when? From Genesis from creation to the flood. On the Sistine Chapel, 4 years. We'll get back to all that, but
4 years to
paint it.
complete a painting.
Yeah,
That's it, not 4 years from.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah, not. All right, so that takes us to 600. That's all I have to say about it. I just wanted to introduce you to Augustine. He wrote a book two books, Confessions, neither of which have I read because I get bored with them. Confessions and The City of God, through the great works, Western civilization period. one of the great writers, great thinkers ever in Western civilization, religious or non-religious, there's no doubt about it.
And where was the Nicene Creed in time?
325. That's at the transition when Constantine took the throne. And that Nicene Creed becomes then the narrative. I'm making that part up. It started there. I'm sort of giving the Nicene Creed the credit for it. That forms the base. If you want to know what these people believed about the world and their place in it, there it is. Stated creedally and narratively, that's it right there. The greatest Christian manifesto ever written. An extraordinary statement of 223 words. I checked into it using Microsoft Word. Thank God they didn't have a word processor. And it took them 325 and 381. It took them 2 church councils and who knows how many man hours of arguing to get these 223 words. This is the 381 Creed. 223 words. Brevity is a sign of genius.
Where was Augustine born?
354, 25 years, 30 years after Nicene Creed. He wrote right at about 400. He was from Hippo, which is the word that's hard to search for ancient Hippo.
Yeah. You get,
In Google, no matter how you do it, you end up just looking at a bunch of hippos. Just, I mean, you know, I just want to see where Hippo is. Tell me where Hippo is.
North Africa.
And it says they're all over Africa. No. You know, the city of Hippo and its hippos. So anyway, Hippo is out here, right here, down the coast. That doesn't matter right now. All right. I'm going to stop here in just a second. Let's go back to our timeline. Put this down. All right. 600, a very, very important, 2 very important events are going to happen. One, you're about to see the rise of Islam, which I don't know enough to talk about. One of the results of that is going to be the destruction of the library in Alexandria, which is where the most important copying from our perspective. I'm an Alexandrian when it comes to text transmission. We'll talk about that later. But that center of learning where that manuscript copying was happening got wiped out very early, which explains why there's so few manuscripts in the Alexandrian text. However, as luck would have it, or God, luck if you're a non-believer, God if you're not. So as God would have it, in his providence, we have 3 Alexandrian manuscripts almost entirely complete from then, which is we have the 3 originals: Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Sinaiticus. And one of those is only partially Alexandrian, but we have that manuscript tradition from the start. And that manuscript tradition forms the basis for the Greek text that underlies every one of your English texts. So you all owe a debt of gratitude for the scholarship that came out of Alexandria prior to the 6th century AD, which is not on this chart. I should have put that. There's no person associated. I should have just put Alexandria. But then also Pope Gregory, named after the fact. Gregory is widely regarded. If you believe that popes existed before Gregory, which I don't, you still have to put Gregory in his own place. That's why they call him Gregory the Great. They also called Leo the Great, but Gregory was a new kind of bishop of Rome, and he took it to a whole new level in terms of the consolidation of the authority of Rome. Not with any malice. I mean, don't assume that. The name should sound familiar because we have something we are currently affected every single day What do we call our calendar? The Gregorian calendar, yeah.
Mr. Gregorian chant, so as a musician.
But anyway, if you're gonna ask, when did the papal tradition start, in my opinion? I'm gonna say 600. With the arrival of Gregory, who didn't want the job. At first. That's often the way it is, but, should probably go read. There's a book out there called The Great Church Fathers, I think. It's like 2 pages on each of these people. It's really handy. I've had it, I gave it away, I bought it again, I gave it away. And now I'm back to not having it, and it's 10:15, thank you. People have things to do, so we'll go ahead and close. Thanks for joining. We got a big agenda, so Phil is barking at me. And
Thank you, Gary.
you're welcome. I'll see y'all later.
Adios.